1,200 years ago, the Vikings explode out of the cold North Sea, like beasts unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. They come from a land of deep-water fjords, hardscrabble farms, and bitter clan rivalries. Today, it is called Scandinavia. It is the late 700s in the uplands of Norway.
We do have some indications of what life was like before the Vikings took to the sea and began their raids. They tend to be a sedentary, agriculturally oriented people who were pretty much organized around villages or clans of some sort, probably familially oriented, although we're not exactly sure about that. But they tended to have chiefs who ruled these little groups and sometimes had war in between them. But the Viking life was very much one of survival. The climate was colder than would have been in the rest of Europe. The weather could be brutal at times. It was probably difficult to stay alive, and that's an important point to make.
At the dawn of the Viking Age, the family farm is the basic economic unit of Norse life. As farmers and herdsmen, they plant grains and vegetables during the short growing seasons, and they rely heavily on livestock. Peace in the Northland is coming to an end. The expanding Viking population is increasing the demand for fertile farmland. Tensions boil over. Inevitably, violence flares between the Viking clans as the stronger attack the weak. The raiders fall on the farmers with axes and swords. Brutal violence. A land feud erupts with utter lawlessness.
Basically, a king was a man who had a big farm. And he had his bonders, his farmers, and his slaves. And whenever he felt like going and attacking somebody else, he just got all his guys together and went off and attacked them. The Vikings would run into the village, grab everything they could, take off again. It's not terribly sophisticated, but very effective.
With land and wealth in short supply in the Northland, some Vikings set aside their differences and prepare to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The hands and tools that once shaped the crossbeams of barns are now put to another task. Along the shores of the northern inlets, something is taking shape, something that will change the lives of these people. A Viking longship. These extraordinary vessels, revolutionary in design, steer history on a new course and launch an onslaught that will dominate Europe and beyond for the next 3 centuries. In the longship, Vikings draw on ages of boat-building techniques and seafaring skills.
There would have been no Vikings without the Viking ship. And it is that evolution of that technology that allowed them to make such a mark on history. In time, they learned to make boats that were seaworthy enough to travel the North Atlantic. This was really what gave the Vikings their long reach. You could put one of these boats together in maybe a month or 6 weeks. And the design was always exactly the same. And they would make the boat either as broad as they needed for calm waters or as deep as they needed it for open oceans. And if they wanted a boat to go up the rivers of Russia or in Europe, a raiding boat that might go into the heart of the continent, they could make the same style, the same construction technique, but just a small version. They were light enough to be carried over portages, they could be dragged up rivers, and they could be sailed. And that was one of the important features because the boats were swift, like lightning, and there wasn't anything that could catch them.
It's no longer a coastal vessel like many of the Mediterranean ones were. They would make the jump from Norway to Scotland, and from the Faroe Islands to Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland, over open waters that were far too dangerous for coastal vessels ever to take on. And the Vikings weren't frightened by this, and they had the technology to make it happen.
The result? A boat with low draft and high adaptability. A technological marvel for its day. No single king or central government guides these people. Each Norse village acts independently. Each declares its own king. The Vikings band together on this bold mission, leaving women and children behind and taking to the seas. Thereafter plunder. So they arm themselves accordingly. Among the first victims of their raiding are the monks of Lindisfarne, along the coast of England in June 793, home to St. Cuthbert's Monastery. Lindisfarne is one of the holiest places in the British Isles, rich with piety and with more tangible treasures.
These monks their bells are ringing, they're going to mass, and up out of the sea come these dragons. And the Vikings came on them just like a storm and cut them down, carried off everything, and burned the place.
The monks were met by hell. And they described it often as if the devils from hell are being unleashed on them. The Vikings were warriors, there's no doubt, but they lived by intimidation, fear, and terrorism. They were raiders. They weren't soldiers.
I think they were extremely fierce and extremely greedy and extremely skillful. I mean, we think of these people as being barbarians, but in fact, I think the order of battle, the way in which they moved on a target in a very disciplined military way.
The Viking warrior was a very simple war machine. It was a big, brawny Scandinavian, often dressed in leather, hide, armor. Each person was equipped with very simple tools: a knife, a sword, and a battle axe. And reportedly, it was the battle axe that was the fiercest of these weapons, because the Vikings had tremendous skill in throwing these axes to, lop off people's heads or incapacitate them.
The monasteries along the coast particularly appeal to the Vikings because of their great accumulation of wealth and the passivity of the monks. It's now the middle of the 9th century, only 50 years or so since Lindisfarne. Word of Europe's removable wealth has spread. Norse families, villages, and whole communities band together to build longships. They plan to improve their station at the expense of the unwitting people across the sea.
All the Spaniards later, when they came to America, they were looking for gold, but the Vikings were looking for silver, and silver was the great thing to them, and a lot of the religious implements, crosses, and the various things that one finds in a monastery were made out of silver.
The Viking factions head out across the sea with no single ruler to unite them. Their fleet swells sometimes to scores of ships. Each fleet still acts independently, making the onslaught all the more difficult to stop. As reputations of individual Viking leaders begin to grow, so too do their ambitions. Europe is theirs for the taking.